All right, this lecture is on Quine's On What There Is. We saw a little preview of it in Devitt's article on ostrich nominalism, right? Quine's view was the view that was sort of put down as ostrich nominalism. So that'll feature in here, but there's also a lot in here. This is a classic article in philosophy, and it's sort of defined an approach to metaphysics that is sort of the contemporary approach, breaking with from the sort of the 18th or 19th century and medieval approach to metaphysics. It really establishes the rules of the game that people have been playing by since. So we're talking about ontology here. Again, ontology is the study of what exists, right? So Quine frames it as the study of ontology is the attempt to answer the question, what is there? And so he makes a little joke at the beginning. He says, well, there's an obvious answer to that question. The answer is everything. But still people disagree about specific. Right? First, he points out one sort of funny thing about those types of disagreements over what exists. If you are denying the existence of something, you seem to be at a bit of a disadvantage, right? So suppose another philosopher, call him McX, right, says that Pegasus exists. There's Pegasus pictured above us, right, the mythical flying horse, right? For him, that's a straightforward claim, right? He's talking about something, it exists, and Pegasus, the thing that exists, makes his statement true. But if I don't believe that Pegasus exists, right, and I want to say, no, Pegasus does not exist, but I still want my sentence to make sense and I still want my sentence to be true, I seem to be talking about Pegasus, right? I seem to be implicitly acknowledging the existence of Pegasus, right, as the thing that exists that makes my sentence true. And this is the riddle of non-being, right? It seems tricky. It's not clear how we can talk about what exists and say true things about, what doesn't exist, say true things about what doesn't exist without sort of implicitly admitting its existence, because otherwise, what are we talking about, right? If there's nothing there to give our sentences meaning, then when I say Pegasus doesn't exist, am I just talking nonsense? It doesn't seem that way, right? So Quine calls this little sort of tangled problem of talking about non-existence Plato's beard. So often people like McX, right? And again, McX is just a made-up name for a philosopher that would hold this view that Pegasus exists. A lot of the time, when you ask them, well, what do you mean, right? I've never seen a Pegasus. I don't think you point to one in the zoo. They're going to say, no, no, no. Pegasus isn't a physical thing, right? It's something else. So what is that something else? Well, there's a few possibilities. One possibility that Quine doesn't think is very good, and no one really seems to believe, is conceptualism. You might say that, oh, Pegasus exists as an idea, right? It's something in people's brains. It's a mental state, right? When I can think about Pegasus, so Pegasus exists in my idea. But that seems to like not be what McX is talking about, right? So yeah, that's not controversial that Pegasus ideas exist. I think everyone can agree with that. Um, but McX is saying something else, right? He doesn't walk around usually confusing ideas with actual things, right? He's trying to say that Pegasus exists in some other way, right? That was never really what McX was ever trying to say, was that Pegasus ideas exist, of course, right? There's another argument against conceptualism that I think is maybe more straightforward. So think about numbers, right? So what is a number, right? Does the number 3 exist, right? As something independent of different sets of threes? When we say things like 3 is prime, we seem to be committing to the existence of the number 3. So could it be that the number 3 is just an idea? Conceptualism is true, then maybe numbers are ideas too. Well, that can't possibly work because look, there's a lot of ideas out there. Suppose an idea is just a firing of neurons in your brain. There's a lot of brains out there, a lot of neurons. There's certainly many, many ideas in existence, but there's not an infinity of ideas in existence, right? There's only a finite number of thinking beings out there in the universe, and they can only have finite number of neurons, right? So even though there's an incredible amount of number ideas, there's more numbers, right? Because there's an infinite number of numbers out there, an uncountably infinite number of numbers, if you know what that means. So it doesn't seem like, right, abstract objects or what when people are talking about things like Pegasus and the number three, they can't be talking about ideas. First of all, that if you asked them, they probably wouldn't say that, right? They wouldn't say, no, I'm not talking about ideas. Second of all, there's just more of those things. There's more abstract objects than there are ideas in existence. Another possibility, which is known in the literature as Meinongianism, and that's probably who Quine is talking about. But again, he makes up a philosopher like me. He says, okay, let's take another philosopher. Let's call him Wyman. Um, so Wyman says Pegasus exists. When you ask him, what does that mean, right? I've never seen a Pegasus. He says, well, Pegasus is an actual, right? So things that are actualized are things you can see, right? Physical objects, chairs, and stuff like that. So Pegasus is an actual, right? He is an unactualized possible, right? Um, but he still exists. Unactualized possibles exist, but not as they don't exist as much as actual things. Actual things have even more existence. I don't know if if you've taken a philosophy course and you've read Anselm's argument for the existence of God. Anselm kind of uses this distinction between things that like actually exist and things that exist only as like possibilities, right? So that's Wyman's approach, right? Pegasus exists as an unactualized possible, but like horses actually exist, right? And that's like a better, a more robust kind of existence. Well, Quine just says, Wyman, I don't know what you're getting at here. It seems to me that all you've done is ruin the word exists for me, right? Like, there's different kinds of exist, right? Different levels of existence, and some things can exist more than other things. Um, Quine says, I take that if that's what you mean by existence, go ahead. I'm going to stick with is, right? As a binary thing. Everything either is or it isn't, right? So that's what Quine means by existence, and that's what Quine thinks ontology is about, right? Tell me what exists, tell me what doesn't exist. There's no like third thing in there. Now, there might be, obviously, things exist in different ways. There's physical things, there's mental things that exist. There might be abstract objects, right? But for anything, either it is or it isn't. There's not like shades of whether it is, right? That's his point. And, he points out a few more problems with Wyman's view, right? Apart from the fact that it doesn't seem to be what people mean by exist. Um, so if there are unactualized possibles, right, then presumably in the doorway here, there's a possible fat man, right? And there's also a possible bald man and all kinds of possible men in the doorway. Um, let's take the possible fat man and the possible bald man. Are they the same man or are they two men? And how would we ever know, right? Um, exactly how many possible men are in the doorway, right? And are they alike? Are they different, right? If they're alike, are they the same man? Is there even a meaningful way to talk about whether two possible beings are identical or are different, right? Um, it seems to breed all kinds of confusion, right? As opposed to the way we talk about actual like physical objects. So, maybe Wyman could get to work and try to work out an answer. Um, but again, Quine just says, I want to clear Wyman's slum, right, of all these possible creeps and just be. Um, so is this an argument? This part of Quine's, paper is like kind of funny and fun, but he mostly kind of makes fun of Meinongianism. I don't know that he decisively refutes it, right? Um, I guess it is unattractively complicated, right? And typically, again, we're going to favor simpler theories. So that may be the argument, right? So how do we clear this slump? So a lot of what Quine does here is just not so much argue, but he gives us a nice regimented way of talking about what exists, right? And you can disagree with him if you want, right? You could be a Meinongian if you want. but the overall system that he gives us is so sort of unified and attractive that it's dominating from this point forward. So how can we clear Wyman's slum? Well, we need to enforce some rules on how possibility is talked about, how the word possibly can be applied. And Quine proposes a nice way to deal with this. He says, look, let's only apply possibility or the word possible to entire sentences. So, for example, we can say sensibly, it is possible that there is a man in the doorway, right? But let's not say there is a possible man in the doorway, right? So let's not move those, what they're called modal operators, like possibly. Let's not move them inside the sentence and apply them to individual objects. Let's just talk about possible states of affairs, right? Let's talk about the whole sentence. That way we don't get into all this confusion that he talks about in the last slide. Further problems for Wyman, right? So, if we insist on applying possibility to particular objects, you got the issue of like, well, are there possible round squares out there? That's not even an unactualized possible. That would be like an unactualized impossible, right? Because round squares are impossible. So what would Wyman say about those? Do those exist? Or is it even contradictory to talk about those? So in general, again, Quine says if we just restrict the use of possibility to just overall states of affairs instead of particular objects, put our possibly at the beginning of the sentence, we're not going to run into all these complicated problems. Okay, so remember the question was, how do we talk about things that don't exist without admitting they exist? And part of that process is going to be, how do we deal with names, right? What is it to use a name? What do we mean when we use a name? If we say Pegasus, does that entail that Pegasus exists, right? And he says we can get around that if we use Russell's theory of names, which is a descriptive theory of names. So, according to Russell, any name, what its actual meaning is a sort of a definite description that picks out a particular person or thing. So Walter Scott, who is an author, he says that name actually can be translated into a description that picks out one and only one person, the author of Waverley. Waverley's a novel. I've italicized that. If we use that account of names, and this is controversial, if you know Saul Kripke, you'll know that he later pretty much got rid of the view. I don't think it's a popular view anymore. But, at the time, this is Quine, right? He's saying let's use Russell's descriptive theory of names, and that's going to help us talk about things like that. So now, when we say Pegasus doesn't exist, we can translate that into something like there is no object that is a horse and has wings, right? Or more conveniently, invent a predicate like Pegasizes, right? And then you can say there is no object that Pegasizes. And now that is equivalent to all objects are such that they do not Pegasize, right? Now we're only talking about things that exist, but we have managed to deny the existence of Pegasus, right? By instead of using a name, right, translating that name as a definite description, and then saying everything in the world does not fit that description, right? Equivalent to saying Pegasus does not exist, but we're only talking about things that do exist in order to say that. So, in general, he thinks the whole problem of Plato's beard came up from a confusion between meaning and naming, right? So, McX, remember McX, our original Pegasus exists. He thought in order for the word Pegasus to have meaning, there has to be an object corresponding to that word, right? But meanings and names are different, right? And McX should have noticed this, right? If he'd noticed that morning star and evening star both pick out the same object, Venus, but have different meanings, right? Meanings and the objects they pick out come apart, right? And if you use the descriptive theory of names, then you sort of have captured the meaning, right? Gotten rid of the name, and then you don't run into this Pegasus problem. So now, at this point, he reviews the one over many argument, right, which we already saw in Devitt, but let's go over it again. So here's McX's argument for the existence of abstract objects. Look, there's red houses, there are red roses, and there are red sunsets. And all of these things have something in common. what they have in common must be redness, right? So redness must exist, and redness is independent of any of the particular red things. So McX thinks that this fact that there are many red things in the world needs an explanation, and that the best explanation of that, there is something called redness that exists, right, that is independent of all those things. And we've seen Quine's response already in Devitt, which was called ostrich nominalism. And Quine simply says, I don't think that needs to be explained, right? That a house is red doesn't need redness to explain it. Maybe that's just a basic fact that some things are red, right? And this is the view that Armstrong, who we haven't read, but who gets mentioned in the Debits, calls that ostrich nominalism, right? He thinks Quine is just burying his head in the sand, insisting that the fact that some things are red doesn't need an explanation. And whereas Quine is saying, I don't see how that abstract object, the universal redness, right? How is it helping? It's not really any better than just saying it's a fact that some things are red. Now, remember, Quine said, but where McX went wrong, right, was that he wasn't clear on this distinction between names and meanings, right? Now, McX might turn around and say, haha, you know what, I just caught you, Quine, because if you think there's a distinction between names and meanings, then you must think meanings exist. And what the heck is a meaning, right? Again, it's probably not a mental thing, because the meaning of red is sort of independent of any one person's brain, right? If we all are saying and understanding the same word, then it must be sort of independent of the two of us, right? And meanings must be abstract objects, right? And Quine admits this is a better argument, right, than the one over many argument. And really the only way out of that is to deny that meanings exist. So he denies that meanings exist, right? Now it says that doesn't mean that our sentences can't be meaningful, right? He doesn't particularly like that word meaningful because it seems to suggest that there is such a thing as meaning that the sentence is full of, right? But that's just metaphor. So he says, let's say that statements are significant. Because statements can be significant in lots of ways, and they don't have to be universal. Right? They don't have to be abstract objects. So maybe it's just a basic fact, just like it's a basic fact that some things are red. Maybe it's also just a basic fact that sentences are significant and they don't need to be explained. Or maybe the significance of a statement can be analyzed behaviorally, right? So the meaning, such as it is, can be cashed out as my certain dispositions to utter certain sentences in certain circumstances, right? There's a behavioral analysis of meaning. Maybe you can make some progress there. But at any rate, Quine thinks that we don't need to explain meanings of abstract objects. Okay, so you might ask Quine, so what does exist, right? You've insisted that existence is a binary thing, right? There's no unactualized possibles, whatever that means, right? And he's insisted that we don't have to commit to the existence of universals or Pegasus just because we want to be able to talk about things that don't exist, or we want to, have multiple things in the world be read, right? So far, it seems like he's saying there's a lot of stuff that I'm not committed to existing. So what do you commit to existing, and what's your criterion? And Quine says we're committed to the bound variables in our statement. This is going to, if you haven't taken logic or predicate logic, we'll take a moment to explain. I'm not going to get too deep into the logic, but try to follow me for a little bit just to understand what Quine's criterion is. Okay, so suppose I say the person who wrote Waverley is holding a scarf, right? And here is its translation in logical terms. So this backwards E is existence. It's stating that something exists, and the X is just a variable. So it's saying some exists in X and exists a Y. This is saying two things exist, right? And then in the parentheses, it says more about that X and Y. So let's concentrate on the capital letters. Those are the predicates, right? So these are the things that are describing the object. So This sentence says there's an X that exists, there's a Y that exists, and the X is P. So here P stands for is a person, right? So we know a person exists, and then this capital W is a two-place predicate, right? So it's about a relation, and this W stands for wrote. So here X wrote Waverley, and the lowercase w is Waverley, the novel, right? So we have a person exists, that person wrote Waverley, and now we have a capital S that stands for is a scarf, right? So there's another thing, the Y, that is a scarf, right? And capital H is the holding relation, and it says X is holding Y, right? So this sentence says the person who wrote Waverley is holding a scarf, right? So the bound variables are the lowercase x and y, right? X and y are the variables here. They're bound by the little existence quantifiers, the ex and the ey, right? So everything that's in the parentheses is bound by that prefix. And so whatever, all those lowercase x's and y's, right, and the w within that parentheses, he says you're committed to the existence of those things. So what are we committed to when we say the person who wrote Waverley is holding a scarf? We're committed to the existence of a person, the existence of a scarf, and the existence of a novel. Now, it just so happens that Waverley is a name, right? So according to Russell's account that Quine accepts, we should analyze Waverley as another description, right? So maybe to be like the first Scottish novel to sell whatever, however many copies or something like that. But you could have some description that would pick out that book precisely. So then you'd have an even more complicated sentence in the logic language and try to keep it sort of simple, right? So again, we're committed to three things here, right? A person, a scarf, and a book. We are not, according to Quine, committed to any of those capital letters. So we are not committed to universals of redness, scarfness, roteness, or holdingness, right? We're just committed to those objects that happen to be written by somebody and so on. So hopefully that makes sense. We can go over it in discussion. Okay, so if that's Quine's um, criterion of ontological commitment, right? Um, it's going to turn out that he will be committed to the existence of numbers. So let's talk about numbers a bit. So he says there's three possible positions you could have on numbers. So one is Platonism or realism, that numbers exist as abstract objects. Conceptualism, right? You might say, no, numbers are just ideas. Or formalism, which I'll explain in a minute. So we should hopefully understand Platonism roughly now, right? Numbers are non-spatiotemporal objects that nonetheless exist, right? Just as much as physical objects exist, they just can't see them or touch them, right? They're causally isolated from our world. That's one view you could have. Conceptualism is the view that numbers are ideas, right? And we saw that the problem with that is that there is a finite number of ideas, right? Because there's just a finite number of brains and neurons in the universe, but there are infinite numbers, right? There's the cardinal numbers are infinite, but also the real numbers are like even more infinite. There's different kinds of levels of infinity. So there's far more numbers than there are ideas in the world. So that's a problem for conceptualism. And formalism is a view that Quine doesn't try to refute. You might want to explore. I think Wittgenstein was a formalist. That says that mathematical statements don't try to refer to anything that exists. They're simply moves in a game, and the rules are set out in axioms, right? So they're not trying to talk about anything that exists, right? It's just the rules of a game that have been invented. But nonetheless, that game is very useful. So that's another approach. If that's interesting to you, I don't really spend much more time on this course. Okay, so what would Quine say about a sentence like 3 is prime? So it seems to say something in logic language like capital P, lowercase t, right? So t is 3 and capital P is prime. From that you can derive exists in xpx, right? We seem to be committed, right? That is a bound variable in that statement, x, right? We seem to be committed to the existence of something that is prime. So according to Quine's criterion, if we take that sentence at face value, we're committed to the existence of the number three, right? Um, Now you might think, why are we trying to discover what exists, right, by looking at people's language, right? Doesn't that feel sort of arbitrary? Like, who cares what I'm committed to or what I believe in, right? Don't we want to know what actually exists, right? Um, yeah, that may be a concern, right? Um, but what we're really trying to do here is, like, if that's the case, I think a lot of the time what metaphysicians are trying to do is actually regiment our language, right? They're not so much worried sometimes about what exists, or sometimes they'll say that's sort of up to science, right? But they're trying to figure out, well, what is the relation, the logical relation between the things we say and the things we believe and what's actually out there, right? And that's an important thing that needs to be worked out as well. We want to be able to be clear about how we speak and say things that are truthful. But I mean, I think here's Quine's argument, right, for why um, uh, for how we should approach the existence of numbers and abstract objects, right? So he says, what we're trying to do, what everyone at this university is trying to do, is figure out the most complete and simplest theory of the universe, right? This is the job of science and even the job of philosophy, right? Even the job of history. We're trying to figure out everything that happened. What are the laws that govern everything, right? What are all the true sentences about the world? So there's lots of different ways to approach this, and different sort of theoretical virtues play off of each other. So, for example, I could say one theory of the universe that would be perfectly sensible would be only talk about sense experience. After all, that's our only, right? Our immediate experience is only what our eyes and our ears, right, and our nose give us, right? We don't have sort of access to objects in the world independent of our senses, right? So if you wanted to be very strict, you might only refer to sensory experience, right? Um, and you could have a theory of the world like that. It would be a bit more complicated, right? So if I want to talk about there being a desk in front of me, right? If I were to restrict myself, or if I were to talk about the desk in front of me, if I were to restrict myself to the sensory experience, uh, sometimes there's a rectangular sensation if I'm looking down from it directly, right, from above. But if I'm looking at it from an angle, it's more of a rhomboid sensation, right? If I look at it from a side, it's a different sort of rectangular sensation. So a single physical object, if I want to not talk about physical objects and only talk about sensations, there's a lot of different thing, right? I'm gonna have now all of a sudden I have like three, four, maybe infinite, right, different sensations all connected with this desk, right? If I want to loosen up a little bit and say like, yeah, obviously there's sensory experience, but I think it's a good idea to posit that there may also be physical objects out there, right? There's good reason to do that because it simplifies our theory quite a bit, right? Now I can talk about a single desk instead of an infinite number of different shape sensations, right? Rectangles and rhomboids and things like that. So it simplifies our theory to posit physical objects. So sometimes, so the question is, would it simplify our theory even further, right? So we can admit sensory experiences, and if we also admit physical objects, we get a much prettier theory, right? Much simpler, more elegant theory. So if we posit another type of existence, abstract objects, does that simplify our theory, right? Does it make it even more attractive? And Quine wants to say, yes. Positing the existence of numbers and abstract objects simplifies our theory of the world in the same way that positing physical objects simplifies our theory of the world. Um, if you want to insist that, either one is simply a useful myth, right? Um, you could do that, but you're sacrificing a more elegant theory of the world, right? And really, the choice can be fairly arbitrary, right? So uh, we saw in the history of mathematics, we've seen that Russell's paradox and then Gödel's proof of the incompleteness of mathematics require us to just sort of arbitrarily adopt axioms. So to get from set theory to mathematics, right, to get around Russell's paradox, you just have to sort of like gerrymander it and just plug in an axiom that basically makes sure that paradox doesn't happen, right? It's not quite as elegant, but right, or it's not like automatically implied by our naive idea of sets, right? But we have to plug it in. And modern physics, right? Quantum physics says we might have to give up on certain principles of logic, right? So we have to admit that the electrons in superposition are in an indeterminate state, right? Sort of uncomfortable if you think that, the principle of non-contradiction or the principle of excluded middle says everything either is or isn't, right? There's no sort of like vagueness in the world. Well, according to quantum mechanics, it looks like the best approach, right, is to just give up on some basic principles of logic sometimes, right? So the idea is all that is like we're going to have to be flexible even with some of our most deeply held intuitive beliefs, right? One of which would be that look, there's just physical things that exist, right? There's no realm of abstract objects where the numbers live, right? That sounds crazy. And Quine says, well, if the best theory posits a realm of abstract objects where numbers exist, then you may have to give up some of your most deeply held beliefs, right? Um, he says everything's an open question. Scientific investigation will move along, and if it says we have to get rid of the principle of non-contradiction, then we do that, right? If that's the and if we have to accept that abstract objects exist, we'll have to accept that too. So in the end, even though Quine has given us some right arguments against the existence of universals, or at least why we don't need to be convinced by like the one over many arguments, stuff like that, in the end, he does support the existence of abstract objects in Platonism because he thinks our best scientific theory and our most elegant scientific theory requires that numbers exist, then we should believe that numbers